All right. Thank you for joining me and learning more about the managing of your land for reptiles and amphibians. My name is Misi Stine, and just a little bit about me. I'm an environmental educator with a vast array of experience. I was the outreach director at the International Wolf Center for 4.5 years. I've spent a lot of time facilitating workshops for Project Learning Tree and Project Wild. I'm a Minnesota Master Naturalist, volunteer and instructor. And as it relates to this presentation, I am a longtime member of the Minnesota Herpetological Society, and I've served in several capacities with that organization, including the president of the board for 2 years. And I really enjoy the work that I do. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy my presentation today. All right, so when we talk about reptiles and amphibians, these are really two different groups of animals and are different in many ways. Often they are grouped together, and the collective study of them is known as herpetology. Today, as I talk more about them, you will often hear me refer to them as herps rather than reptiles and amphibians. So I kind of group them together under that, how we study them. Today's presentation is a 30,000-foot look at land management for these incredible critters. I will provide a resource list to help you go more in depth on this topic today, if you would like to have that provided to you. All right. So the key points today that we're going to cover in the presentation are how to determine what species are best to manage for on your land, 3 elements to consider when managing your land for reptiles and amphibians, and best practices when managing your land for these critters. So what species to manage for on your land? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience. So in 2020, my partner and I purchased land in Turtle River Township, which is just west of Bemidji. And we are currently now ourselves trying to figure out how best to manage our land for herps, among other species. We have other interests as well. But what I found in that area is something different than I might have hoped for. I guess that's a nice way to say it. So I have to look at the best strategies and not waste time on animals not found in the North Woods. So as I explored, I realized that my favorite rattlesnake species, which is the timber rattlesnake, and it's found here in Minnesota, but not where our land is. And for me, it would be a waste of time to concentrate on managing for this species. It wouldn't matter if I attempted to create the best human-made bluff prairie habitat for rattlesnakes. I'm not ever going to have them on my land. Herps do not disperse over long distances, and a lone bluff prairie created in the middle of the North Woods would not support this species anyway. Timber rattlesnakes, just for your reference, are only found in the driftless area in approximately 5 counties in southeastern Minnesota. So what you want to do, and what we're doing is to assess the habitats that we have on our land. Do we have prairie and grassland? Do we have desert? Are we in mountain habitat or in a forest? And if so, what kind of forest are you managing in? Second, look at the different habitat features you have. Are there lakes, rivers, ponds, rock outcroppings? And where are your edge habitats, also referred to as ecotones? There's also a consideration of wetlands. And are they temporary and seasonal, or are they permanent? Once you understand the surroundings that you have, it's important to do some research on what's native to that area. You can go to your DNR or equivalent state agency and look up information on the species found in your part of the state. Often there's good information on where native herps have been documented, where they're likely to be found, their preferred habitat, food sources, and other important information to help you in your decision making. In addition, there are some really great books out there that focus on a particular state or region to help you learn more about your reptiles and amphibians. And it gives a lot of the same information you may find at the DNR website and additional information on their history, range maps, and other things that you might find helpful. As you spend time in and around your land, I suggest that you create an inventory of what you see. And do what many of us reptile and amphibian geeks do, create a life list. If you're a birder, you may already be familiar with what a life list is. It's a collection of everything you've seen and the details about those observations. This information will help you manage your land better over time. As you make certain improvements and make certain changes, you'll be able to track what happens with those reptiles and amphibians. Now, you can create this life list and documentation in a written journal if you prefer. But if you do that, please take pictures or record the calls of the herps that you find. Specifically, the calls you would record would be frogs and toads. That information will aid in confirming identification of species, because sometimes you have species that look similar. And so to confirm that identification, having a call or a picture is important. The more detailed records that you keep, the better. Now, there are also some really great apps out there that can help do this for you. The first is iNaturalist. It's an app that you can document all of your plant and animal finds together. And it's a pretty popular app that a lot of naturalists and other people interested in working with nature use to document what they find. The other app, which is what I use to record all of my reptile and amphibian finds and where I manage my life list, HerpMapper. HerpMapper is a great app for just looking at reptiles and amphibians. Not only do you record data there, but HerpMapper collaborates with multiple partners who are doing research and conservation work with reptiles and amphibians around the world. When you log in, you can see your specific entries and all of the detailed information about where you found it and the pictures that you provide and our call documentation. But others who want to see what you found can only see a high level view, the photo that you submitted or the call, the name of the species that you found, and what county and state the critter is found in. That is important because herps are vulnerable to persecution and collection for both food and the pet trade. Both of these things are having a negative impact on species survival in the wild throughout the world. With either of these apps, you should enter any living or dead critters that you observe. And if you cannot ID those critters, don't worry. There's a community of people that will help with that, that participate in the management of these apps. All right, so the three elements that we want to consider as we think about any animal's survival is what food, water, and shelter or space resources they require. But the details of how those requirements are met vary widely with the species we're talking about today. So let's start out and let's take a look at food resources for reptiles. We think of snakes as carnivores that eat rodents like mice, chipmunks, and rats. Although that is true, there's actually a wide variety of items that these different species eat. For example, the common garter snake will also eat invertebrates like snails and slugs, and that makes them a beneficial critter in your garden. And then the eastern hognose snake specializes in frogs and toads. Lizards, like our Minnesota skinks and the six-line race runner, eat insects and other invertebrates, and even other small lizards. Across the spectrum of lizard species around the world, they have a wide variety of foods that they include in their diets, including plant materials. And then, of course, there are turtle species, which show a wide variety in the types of diets they consume as well. Turtle species run the spectrum from herbivores, omnivores, to carnivores. And some water turtle species perform an important role by eating the dead plants and animals, keeping our aquatic environments clean. And then there are the amphibians. In Minnesota, we have frogs and salamanders. They are also predators, but are considered generalists. If they can fit it in their mouth, they will eat it. Any kind of flying or crawling invertebrate, they will consume. Some examples of what they eat are flies, butterflies, spiders, pillbugs, worms, slugs, and snails. And in the water, they will consume the aquatic invertebrates, and even tadpoles or smaller individuals of their own species. Water. Water is important for drinking, but for some species, they are aquatic or semi-aquatic, and they call the water their home. And others, like frogs and salamanders, rely on water for breeding. On another note, some species can obtain most of the water that they eat from their food. So when we are experiencing drought conditions, or if they live in arid regions, they can obtain water from their food. And this is also true of wolves. Wolves get most of their water from the food that they consume. So it's true of certain mammal species as well. Habitat management for shelter and space. As we think about the environmental needs of amphibians and reptiles, it's important to remember that they are ectotherms, which means they are unable to regulate heat inside of their bodies and must use the environment to warm up or cool off. This is demonstrated in behaviors such as basking in the sun when it's cool or moving to a shady spot when they're too warm. This process limits how widely they are distributed across the habitats that they live in and when they can be active. On the upside, they can live on less energy than mammals and birds of similar size. The necessity to regulate their body temperature is critical as it impacts all of their metabolic processes as well as their reproductive success. Herps are also secretive, in part because of their behavior strategies. This is to regulate their body temperatures, but also to avoid predation. When reptile and amphibian geeks like myself are out field herping, sometimes we get lucky and find animals on the crawl, the slither, or the hop. But most often we have to know where to look for them and what the best times are to find them. I got a little bit ahead of myself. They can be found under fallen logs, in wood piles, in brush piles. Those things all provide really great habitat for them. It's shelter, but also they find food in their shelter locations. In addition, some hide under rocks or even overwinter and spend time under the leaf litter. They also use rock outcroppings and even the burrows, and even will burrow down below the frost line to spend the winter. As you consider your land management strategies, think about how you can provide shelter for herps, and where it is practical, please don't disturb the habitat as it exists. Another thing to consider is herps will even use man-made structures or human-made structures to find food, water, or shelter. In the first year on our new property, we found a tree frog hiding in the shelter for the housing for our trail camera, as in the picture on the right. And this weekend, we moved a shed that we put up about a month ago to put a subfloor underneath it to find this lovely blue spotted salamander, making themselves comfortable under this artificial structure. In the first year, we've observed a total of 8 herp species, either through visual observation or the calls that the frogs were making in the spring. So we feel like we're already off to a really good start. The final part of my presentation will focus on land management tips and other information to help you think about how to support herps on your land. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I hope that it will encourage you to do more research of your own. So tips on land management practices. Number 1, reptiles and amphibians have different needs in general. You will have to make some decisions about what you're going to manage for in different areas of your property. Reptiles like drier, more open woodland and grassland habitat, When you're thinking about managing your forest, different strategies will yield different results for the species on your land. Whether you're thinking about thinning, select cutting, or clear cutting an area of your land, all of those different strategies will impact species differently. So doing research on that is helpful ahead of time. Amphibians, on the other hand, prefer dense canopy with sparse understory vegetation and a thick leaf litter. Those environments tend to favor the shade and moisture that they need to protect their semi-permeable skin. The reality for amphibians is if they desiccate or dry out, they will die. So being able to be in those shady, moist areas is important for survival. Tip number 2, managing for edge habitats, or the ecotones that I mentioned earlier, to allow for gradual shifts in plant species, the amount of moisture, temperature, and other factors. Species like this fox snake that is pictured on this slide love edge habitat. Number 3, preserving corridors that connect habitats are important for gene flow, reduce road mortalities, allowing for immigration and migration, and to reduce the risk of exposure to predators. Number 4, when performing land improvements like controlled burns, mowing, grazing, or forest thinning, it's best to perform these tasks when the herps are in their inactive period. Herps are most active between 50 and 80 degrees after rains or floods. And the highest impact on herps is in the spring and fall when they're migrating to and from breeding and overwintering sites. So try to focus those improvement activities during the hottest part of the day, during dry spells, or on unreasonably cold days. Tip number 5, leave about 200 meters of suitable habitat that's untreated where you're performing improvements to ensure that herps in the habitat have resources for survival through that process. Number 6, use rotational methods for improvement of your land so that the habitat is not disturbed too frequently. That will benefit the herps as well. Tip number 7, when mowing, set your deck height at about 10 to 12 inches. Mow from the center out to allow any critters the chance to escape as you're mowing. Please don't remove cover objects if at all possible. And one other thing to remember, herps will freeze if they feel threatened, hoping that they can camouflage and avoid the perceived danger around them. A former coworker of mine, her husband manages a golf course and runs the lawn equipment there. And she commented to me one day about how stupid snakes were, that they just laid there while the mower was coming right at them. These critters, like many others, have evolved strategies to avoid predators over hundreds or thousands of years and don't understand modern equipment or how to protect themselves. That snake is simply freezing, hoping that the danger will go away. So please keep these critters' natural behaviors in mind as well, because they probably don't understand what you're doing. Tip number 8, when using chemicals, use them sparingly, follow the directions closely, and only treat what is necessary. Poisons to control pests are particularly problematic for herps because the critters ingest the poison and go off somewhere else to die. But before they die, they could be eaten from animals higher up in the food web, including snakes, turtles, lizards. And so think about that and think about how that might kill those predators up the food chain that you don't intend to target. If possible, use mechanical methods if you need to manage your pests, manage pests on your property. One method to manage pests is to manage for the animals that eat those pests. So if you're managing for snakes, you could potentially help to reduce your rodent population on your property. You could also reduce slugs and snails in your garden if you have those garter snakes hanging around. A good friend of mine has land up in the UP, And for more than 10 years, there was a large fox snake that frequented his garage and surrounding area. This fox snake was doing a really fine job of managing the mice, but they didn't really realize how good of a job the snake was doing until they stopped seeing it last season. Since then, the mouse population in their garage has increased significantly. Finally, limit your use of glue strips to indoor spaces to have the best chance of protecting non-target species from being injured or killed when they get stuck on the glue trap. So those are my tips for land management practices. Next, let's talk a little bit about the introduction of species that are non-native to the habitat. The introduction of non-native species has negative impacts on our ecosystem, including negative impacts on herps. Please use plants and trees that are native and the best fit for the habitat that they're planted in. And avoid the introduction of non-native species like pets. It could be a reptile or amphibian. It could be the release of a cat or a dog. That is also important. Also, the release of non-native fish is also a concern. These invaders cause declines in our native populations because they outcompete the natives for resources. And in some cases are able to consume large numbers of native animals, causing a decline. A special note of concern is to not introduce fish to bodies of water where they're not already found. Amphibians need fishless ponds and wetlands to reproduce. Where fish are introduced, there are declines in the reptile amphibian species or complete loss of that amphibian over time due to the lack of successful reproduction. Keeping healthy populations of herps also requires a wise use of our resources. Currently, there are steep declines of herp species around the world due to the removal of them for pets and for sources of food. This includes many turtles that are removed from the wild to be sold to places like China, where there's unsustainable consumption of the turtle species around the world. In addition, there are also individuals that do not like herps and will kill them if given a chance. Please don't give the specific location of species you find on your land to help reduce the chance of them being killed or illegally collected to be brought into the pet trade. Snakes. How do you manage for snakes when you're afraid of them or are concerned about venomous species? Well, remember that snakes are more afraid of you than you are of them. Seriously, humans look like giant predators from the snake's point of view, and they know they are no match for a giant predator, particularly humans with many tools at their disposal to kill them if they decide to. Snakes are also important parts of our ecosystem and provide us with important services, like eating rodents and other pests, some of which carry diseases. There was a study out about 5 years ago that looked at areas where rattlesnakes lived, that they had lower instances of humans contracting Lyme's disease. And the reason seems to be that the rattlesnakes are eating a good number of those mice, which are the vector for Lyme's disease to be transmitted across species. Also, know what species are found in your area. If there are venomous species, know how to ID them. Respect them and give them space. The vast majority of bites occur when people are intentionally handling or trying to kill a snake. And venomous snakes can still envenomate a person for hours after their death because it takes their nervous system time to shut down when they die, and that bite is a reflex in that period of time. A few things to remember when living with venomous snakes. Don't walk around outside at night without a source of light so you can see where you're stepping. Always wear shoes that cover your feet. So in other words, no bare feet, no sandals, no flip-flops when you're in areas where you know you have venomous snakes. And be careful about where you place your hands. look first, especially when reaching into places snakes could find shelter or could be basking, like when you're trimming your bushes in your front yard, or when you're climbing up rock outcroppings where they might be on the next ledge above getting some sun. If you have a snake hanging around your home or other structures, it's because there's food, water, or shelter, right? Those essential elements for survival. If you can remove or eliminate or limit those essential elements, they won't be as willing to hang out. In addition, if a snake is in your space, you can gently use a long-handled push broom or lightly spray it with a garden hose. It will definitely get the message and move along. If it's a difficult place to manage an unwanted snake, call for help from a qualified wildlife handler. The other piece to this, if you are trying to move snakes out of your area, please do not move any herp, including snakes, more than 1/4 mile from where they're found. They have defined home ranges, and moving them further from their home range decreases their chance of survival. They will oftentimes try to return to their home range, risking crossing roads and getting hit by cars. They will be probably put into another territory or home range of another snake and could be killed. They also will have trouble finding the food and shelter that they need because they know their home range. They know where their resources are. And the reality is, in the end, that other individuals will come in and take their place. When that opens up, when a snake dies or leaves, another snake will move in and take over that territory, particularly if there are good resources that that snake might be able to use, especially when it's a young one that's dispersing and looking to establish a home range. And finally, I just want to say that I always respect individuals and their fear of snakes or other animals. But my hope is that if you don't learn to love snakes, that you'll learn to appreciate their role in the ecosystem and find ways to coexist, even if it always doesn't seem comfortable to us as humans. One final note today, new and problematic diseases are causing declines in our herp populations around the world. Studies have found that habitat loss, degraded habitat, introduced species, the improper use of chemicals, and changes to the climate are causing stress in many herp species. That stress allows them to become more vulnerable to contracting disease and parasites. With efforts from folks like you to give reptile and amphibian habitat in your land where they can find food, water, and shelter, that will go a long way to reducing that stress and improving the chances that the next generation will be able to enjoy those wild populations. So I want to thank you for spending some time with me today. I look forward to seeing you at the Q&A session on October 19th and answering your questions. Have a great day.